He was standing beside Athena, but Cathy's heart kept calling out to him. He kept looking at her as she closed her eyes and resigned herself to her death. The pain in his heart suddenly became unbearable, and as the king gave his signal, Mason realized that he couldn't let Cathy leave this world. The guards pulled the iron, and the rope around Cathy's neck slowly began to pull her off the ground. Without thinking twice about it, Mason pushed the guards in front of Cathy and ran towards her, much to the surprise of everyone. He pulled out his knife as he got close to her and cut off the rope from above her head. Cathy fell weakly on the floor and kept her eyes closed. She didn't know what was happening, but she was able to breathe once again. All the guards took out their weapons and advanced towards Mason, who had his back to them. Mason wanted to help Cathy off the ground, but he heard the guards coming behind him. He turned and faced them all. Assuming a battle stance, he pointed his sword forward and said loudly, "Death to whoever tries to harm the maiden." From the ground where she lay weakly, Cathy heard a familiar voice. At first she thought it was Damien, but a different face came to her mind. She realized it was the voice of someone she now hated, the same voice that always terrified her. What could be going on? Did Damien ask him to help her? Was that why he was going against everyone for her sake? But he was in love with Princess Athena, and since she was about to be executed for stealing Athena's jewels, he naturally should be on Athena's side. Why was he going against the woman he loved and the king as well, when he knew that it would block his chances of ever making her his bride? Cathy could not understand what was going on. She wanted to open her eyes and see for herself, but she felt so weak and sleepy that opening her eyes seemed like the hardest thing to do at the moment. She didn't know how everything would turn out in the end. She didn't know if Mason would succeed, but more than that, she didn't trust him. For all she knew, he could be acting just to increase her misery. He may want to kill her himself or ask Athena to do it. She didn't want to get her hopes up. She had already accepted that she was going to die, so she still lay on the ground, expecting the worst. Meela felt so afraid, and as she stared at Mason, she recalled the prophecy about his marriage to Cathy. She had thought that the witch's spell was strong enough to make Mason hate Cathy. If she had known that he would not be able to see her die, she would have come up with a better plan. Perhaps arrange with some men to kill her in the bush while she was going to get Athena's flowers in the morning. That would have been the best. She realized she had made a big mistake and wished she could turn back the hands of time, but it was too late now. Athena's heart was beating very fast, and she was now crying. She loved Mason so much that she could not imagine her life without him. Seeing the way he was standing up for Cathy without regard for her or the king was something she could not accept. Prophecy or not, Mason loved her. The way he always stole fiancés at her and the passionate kisses she shared. Despite all what Meela had told her before, she didn't want to believe that he would choose the ugly Cathy over her, the most beautiful princess who ever lived. Seeing that the princess was now crying, the king became angry and ordered his guards. "Do not be afraid. Traitors are not welcome in this kingdom, and neither are thieves. Death to Mason and the thief." The moment he heard the king's orders, Jackson quickly ran to Mason's side and took out his sword, ready to fight beside him. Mason didn't want to hurt the guards because in his opinion they were not even qualified to fight him. He decided that it was best to escape. Staring at Jackson, he said, "Go get our horses." Jackson ran out through the side while the guards stared at him without knowing what to do. They were all afraid of Mason because they knew how powerful he was. They did not stand a chance against him, but the king had given his order and they had no choice but to obey and prove their loyalty and bravery. They began to advance more closely towards Mason, who still held on to his sword. Soon the guards at the front attacked and began to fight Mason. Mason did not want to kill any of them, so he focused more on evading their attacks and injuring them. Some lost their limbs while others got injuries that threw them on the ground. All the 50 guards who were initially at the front were now on the ground, crying out in pain. The others became afraid and didn't want to go further, but the king, who was livid at this point, ordered, "Do not retreat, take him down." Once more, the remaining guards advanced more closely towards him. Athena, who still held the hope that her relationship with Mason could be savaged, refused to give up. She felt that if Mason ended defeating all the king's guards, then the king would never allow them get married even if Mason apologized. Athena suddenly ran towards Mason. When the guards saw her coming, they made way for her by shifting to the side. She stood in the midst of the guards, in front of Mason with tears in her eyes. She believed that if Mason was staring directly at her, he would not be able to refuse her. With tears in her eyes, she asked, "Why, Mason? Why are you betraying me? I am the one you are getting married to. Why do you take sides with a maid servant who tried to ruin our engagement ceremony? Don't you love me anymore?" The king ordered Athena to get back because it wasn't safe and give the guards a chance to take down the traitor, but she ignored his words and kept staring at Mason as tears fell from her eyes. Kathy, whose eyes were still closed, heard their conversation, but her brain was muddled at this point that she could not make sense of what they were saying. She had earlier believed it was Mason, but now she felt that Damien was the one fighting for her. She began to wonder when Damien had an engagement ceremony with a princess. Mason felt his heart break as Athena looked so pitiful, but he was convinced that saving Kathy's life right now was more important than anything else. He stared at her for a while before saying, "I am sorry, Athena. I really don't know why I am doing this either. I don't understand what is going on, but one thing I am sure of is that I cannot let Kathy die. Not now and not today." Athena saw that Mason's expression softened when he spoke to her and was still convinced that she could change his mind. She threw herself on him and hugged him. "I love you so much, Mason, and I can't live without you. Please don't do this to me." Mason's hands, which were still ready for battle, dropped by his sides and his sword fell from his hand. He was tempted to hug Athena as well, but he held himself back. The more she cried and hugged him, the more he thought about doing what he could to make her happy. He finally hugged her back and began to stroke her hair while everyone stared at them in astonishment, as it couldn't be more obvious that he had a soft spot for the princess. Meela heaved a sigh of relief because if Athena succeeded in taking Mason out of the square, they would go ahead with the execution and their plans would succeed. The king, however, wasn't moved by this. He had already condemned Mason as a traitor in his heart and would not let him be with his daughter even if he retraced his steps. Using his eyes, the king signaled for the guards to go ahead and get Kathy while Mason was still distracted. Mason was now hugging Athena back and closed his eyes as it gave him a good feeling. However, when the guards began to slowly advance once again, his battle instincts kicked in. He pushed Athena away instantly and picked up his sword. Although he had not used any force, because of how strong he was, Athena staggered backward and ended up tumbling down the square. Meela, the queen, and many others screamed as it was obvious that Athena would end up with injuries and broken bones. Meela ran to Athena and helped her up from the ground while the queen stared at Mason and Kathy in surprise. She could not understand what was going on. She vividly recalled that the prophecy said that the strongest warrior who would marry the princess would love her and protect her above all else. However, Mason's actions harmed the princess greatly, and he didn't seem bothered about her pains as he was now fighting off the remaining guards who had charged toward him. Could it be that Mason was not the man in the prophecy? Had they made a mistake, and was it possible that there was another warrior who was stronger than Mason but was yet to arrive at their kingdom? If Mason was the man in the prophecy, one thing the queen was sure of was the fact that he would never betray the princess. Everything was suddenly so confusing, and to make it worse, the king was so angry that he was no longer thinking about his actions. He kept sending more guards at Mason and he defeated them effortlessly. Soon the square was littered with the injured bodies of almost all the guards who were writhing in pain. Jackson arrived at that moment with the horses. When he saw so many men on the floor, he shook his head as he thought that they were all foolish. They were no match for even him, and he could not imagine himself winning against Mason in a fight, so why was their courage bigger than their strength? The moment he saw Jackson, Mason dropped his sword and lifted Kathy from the ground. He gestured toward Jackson, who ran and took Kathy from his arms. He picked up his sword again and slowly followed behind Jackson, who was leading Kathy to the horses. Mason kept pointing his sword forward, ready to fight any more guards who tried to harm Kathy. However, the guards who were left were too afraid to move an inch closer to him. Everyone watched as Jackson placed Kathy on his horse and got on the horse behind her. Holding her with one hand so she wouldn't fall off, he controlled the horse with his other hand and rode it out of the square. Mason got on his own horse and followed behind Jackson while Meela and Athena screamed. Athena was now crying uncontrollably, her whole body in pain, and so was her heart. How could she live without Mason? The king and queen stared at her helplessly without knowing what to do. People stared at the princess in surprise, as no one had ever seen her cry before. Meanwhile, Meela, who knew that they had more serious problems, whispered into Athena's ear, "This is not the time to cry. Our lives are now in danger. We need to pack as much valuables as we can from the palace and leave." Athena realized what Meela was saying and quickly got up from the ground where she squatted. Meela led her out of the square and they made their way back to the palace. No one thought too much of their actions because they had always been very close, and it was no secret that Meela loved the princess more than her own daughter. As they approached the outskirts of the kingdom, the conflicted emotions Mason had ever felt disappeared and was replaced with a feeling of satisfaction. He was now very convinced that what he had done at the square was the right thing to do. The moment they rode their horses out of the kingdom, Kathy became freed from the curse and it instantly began to rain.